Most people, when they think about the time of Jesus, imagine the same things: sandals, sermons, miracles, moral lessons. A distant, valuable, sacred, and completely spiritual world. But for the people who were actually alive back then, life was not nearly that simple. What shaped daily life was not faith as much as money. Or more precisely, the absence of money. The world in which Jesus existed, this reality he was born into, was one of the most unjust economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. This is the territory of the financial historian, where money, power, and history intersect, and where nothing is as innocent or harmless as it first appears. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea was part of the Roman Empire. But Rome did not conquer lands to integrate them. Rome conquered because it needed to feed the center. Provinces and cities existed to move wealth inward. Grain, silver, labor. All of it flowed from the edges of the empire toward Rome. Judea was one of those edges. And the problem was simple: Judea was not rich. It was largely rural, dependent on agriculture, fragile, and weak. People were not farmers in the modern sense. They were peasants with just enough land to survive. When a harvest failed, it didn't mean profits went down. It meant hunger. And Rome did not care. Rome cared about order. And more importantly, about taxes continuing to flow. The tax system was brutal. Today, we pay taxes based on income. Back then, it worked differently. You paid because you existed. Land tax, crop tax, head tax, road tax, and on top of all that, religious taxes. If you couldn't pay, there were no warnings, no appeals, no grace period. The people collecting taxes weren't state employees. The right to collect taxes was sold. These collectors paid Rome upfront, in cash, and then extracted as much as possible from the population. Abuse wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the incentive. If you had no money, you borrowed. And debt was everywhere. And debt always brought trouble. But this wasn't debt like we know it today. There was no bankruptcy, no restructuring. Interest piled up, and land was the collateral. One bad year could push a family onto a road with no return. The story usually repeated itself. A farmer plants. The weather turns. The harvest fails. Taxes are still due. Money is borrowed. Interest accumulates. The next year, the debt remains. Eventually, the land is lost. And one day, the farmer is working as a tenant or laborer on land that once belonged to him. Or he is pushed completely out of the system. This wasn't an accident. This was how the system was designed to work. Over time, land concentrated in the hands of a few. Wealth accumulated among those tied to Rome and the temple authorities. Everyone else became increasingly insecure. Anxiety grew. There was no protective hand of the state. No expectation of help. No unemployment support. No social safety net. When you lost your land, you didn't just lose income. You lost your status. Your security. Your future. Your dignity disappeared, and the anxiety only grew. People weren't poor because they didn't work. They were poor because the system required it. Rome needed surplus. Local elites wanted rent. The temple demanded revenue. And all of this weight fell on people with no margin for error. This kind of environment doesn't produce peace. It produces tension. It raises tempers and fuels conflict. This is why rebellions broke out. This is why banditry exploded. This is why messianic movements emerged. When people heard about debt forgiveness, freedom, and justice, they didn't hear metaphors. They heard a chance to survive. They heard hope and they began to wait for it. The temple was not just a religious center. It was also a bank, a tax institution, and a center of power. Even access to God was tied to money. It sounds ironic, but money held everyone captive. Sacrifice, exchange, payment. That's why Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers was not just a religious act. It was a direct strike at the heart of the system. Rome could tolerate teachers. It could tolerate criticism. But it could not tolerate instability. The conflict was not theological. It was economic. It was political. And the core truth is this: systems do not collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when people stop believing the stories that justify them. When trust breaks. When hope fades. If this perspective gave you a different way of seeing things, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look. Thanks for listening. Take care, my friend.